Let's start with this assumption. Maybe it's a hope, really, that's foundational to modern law. Justice should be blind.
Right.
It should treat the powerful and the poor exactly the same.
That's the ideal, yeah. The one we strive for.
But if we put on our historical lenses today and look back at the ancient world, particularly Rome and Athens,
Yeah.
well, you realize that justice was anything but blind.
Not at all. In fact, you could say ancient law was hyper-aware of your social position.
It wore glasses, didn't it? And those glasses were focused intensely, almost like microscopically, on social status.
Exactly. And that awareness wasn't some kind of bug. It was the feature. It was the mechanism of the system.
So that's our mission today, then, in this deep dive.
That's it. We're going to try and excavate the core insights, really dig into legal standing, social hierarchy, and crucially, the mechanisms of punishment.
And show how privilege determined. Well, not just your daily experience, but sometimes life and death itself in ancient law.
Precisely. How jurisprudence reflected and enforced that hierarchy.
Okay. And we've got some incredible material to work with here. It seems to span everything from, formal Roman legal codes.
Legal codes, political philosophy, especially looking at Athens.
And even really granular details on how the law treated everyone. From the top, the respected senator, all the way down to the slave who was legally just property.
It's a really powerful look at how law often reflects who holds power and, maybe more importantly, who wants to keep that power.
Okay, let's jump right in then.
Right.
So Roman law, we often think of things like order, rationality, maybe even fairness in some contexts.
Sure, structure, the codification.
But when we get to punishment specifically, we hit something, well, something far more brutal and deeply stratified. It seems the foundational Roman principle for consequences was crystal clear.
Absolutely clear. Punishment was not equal. It was dictated almost entirely by social rank.
Okay, let's unpack this system of essentially formalized legal inequality.
Well, what the sources really lay out is a recognized, structured, dual penalty system. It basically divided Roman society for judicial purposes.
Into two groups.
Two main groups, yeah. You had the honestiores, literally the more honorable. These were your higher status folks, senators, equestrians, the wealthy elites in the towns.
Okay, the upper crust.
Exactly. And then you had the humiliores, the lower status classes. This was, most free workers, artisans, farmers, and then below them, obviously, the unfree, the slaves.
And the key thing is, this division directly impacted punishment.
Directly and dramatically. For the very same crime, let's say theft, or even something serious like murder, an honestior might face a fine, maybe temporary exile, relegatio, or, at the absolute worst, a relatively quick execution.
Okay. And for the humilior?
Well, that's where it gets grim. For the same crime, the humilior could face forced labor in the mines, crucifixion, being thrown to wild beasts in the arena, or even being burned alive.
Wow, that is a stark difference. Can we talk about that lower cutoff point? What did it really mean in practice? Were certain punishments just off limits for the elite?
Essentially, yes. Certain degrading, torturous punishments were formally and explicitly reserved for the humiliores and slaves. The law itself made the distinction.
So the law said you couldn't crucify a senator?
Pretty much. If an honestior was condemned to death, the method was often beheading. Relatively swift, seen as more honorable, sometimes even done privately.
But for the lower classes?
It was public, it was agonizing, and it was designed to degrade. Crucifixion, damnatio ad bestias, exposure to beasts, burning alive. These weren't just about ending a life. They were about publicly stripping away any remaining dignity, reinforcing the massive gap between the classes.
So the suffering itself was part of the message, but only for certain people. It was a visible reinforcement of the hierarchy.
Precisely. Make the punishment fit the status, not just the crime.
But interestingly, we found evidence suggesting that sometimes the Senate, the elite body, actually pulled back on extreme severity. Not out of compassion, it seems, but for, well, almost cynical reasons.
That's a fascinating aspect, yeah. It gives you real insight into the Roman legal mindset. Look at electoral corruption, ambitus. Especially around the mid-1st century BC, there was this push to curb it.
Right, bribery and all that.
Exactly. But when proposals came up for really harsh penalties, say, against the guys actually handing out the bribes, the devisers, the Senate, sometimes pushed back.
Why? If they wanted to stop corruption.
Because the proposed penalty was seen as counterproductive.
Counterproductive how? Like, it wouldn't deter people.
Not exactly. It was counterproductive because if the penalty was too severe, say death or permanent, utter disgrace, The juries, even elite juries, would simply refuse to convict.
Ah, okay. So faced with sending someone, maybe even someone they knew, to a truly horrific fate, they just acquit.
That's the idea. They wouldn't stomach it. So you end up achieving nothing, no justice, no conviction, no deterrence. The Senate, wanting the system to actually work and secure some convictions, sometimes had to argue for or accept softer penalties.
So leniency wasn't about humanitas or mercy. It was about systemic efficiency, making sure the machine kept running.
Often, yes. It seems to have been driven by a calculation of utility, making sure the laws could actually be enforced, rather than any real moral softening or concern about the cruelty itself.
That's quite revealing. They were worried less about the cruelty and more about the practicalities of making punishment stick.
Mm.
And speaking of cruelty, or civitia as they called it, the professional jurists, the legal experts, they weren't exactly pushing for moderation either, were they?
No, not typically. You look at someone like Ulpian, a hugely influential jurist, and his attitude gives you this chilling glimpse into the Roman lack of, well, what we might call bleeding hearts today.
How so?
Jurists tended to see law as a technical field. Ulpian, for instance, discusses a scenario where a provincial governor has someone condemned, but the person claims to have vital info for the emperor. Ulpian notes some governors might suspend the execution out of timidity.
Implying that Ulpian wouldn't be timid.
Exactly. The sources suggest Ulpian wasn't particularly horrified by Civitia. In fact, there's evidence he might have positively favored it in certain cases where he felt a really strong deterrent was needed.
So for these legal minds, it was about formalism, application, deterrence. Sentiment didn't really enter the equation?
It seems not. Practical application and maintaining order were the priorities. Sentimentality wasn't part of the legal toolkit.
Okay, so the law was cold, practical, explicitly ranked. Let's drill down on the privileges of the elite. Beyond just milder physical punishment, what other protections did they have? You mentioned special tribunals.
Absolutely. The preferential treatment wasn't just about the sentence, it was procedural too. Members of the higher orders, especially senators, and also soldiers who were kind of a class apart, often got dealt with by special tribunal.
Meaning they didn't go through the regular courts.
Often not. They bypassed the typical courts, which might be more public, maybe subject to popular pressure. Instead, they could be judged by their peers or by a specific imperial delegate. This generally meant a more sympathetic hearing, often a less rigorous process.
And this connects to that key concept that seemed to dictate everything. Conditio personae, the status of the person involved.
Precisely. Conditio personae, the condition or status of the persons involved, was critical in deciding where a trial even took place. This was huge for, say, provincial governors or high-ranking military officers.
How did it work?
If a legal issue involved a high-status individual, like an officer or a provincial magnate, their status itself could be used as a reason to transfer the trial.
Transfer it where?
Usually to Rome, putting it under direct imperial jurisdiction.
And why was getting the case moved to Rome automatically better for the elite defendant?
Several reasons. It moved the trial away from local witnesses who might be hostile, away from local political enemies, away from a local jury who might resent some bigwig imperial official.
Okay, makes sense.
By getting the case to Rome, the defendant often ensured it was handled by an imperial court, closer to the emperor's influence, and judged by people who understood and probably shared their social standing.
So it's like getting to choose a more favorable court.
Essentially, yes. In the later empire, this even had a name, prescriptio fori. It was a built-in structural advantage for the powerful, letting them angle for a friendlier judge and venue.
That's a profound level of structural privilege. Now, even if the crime wasn't serious enough for execution, the non-capital penalties,
Yeah.
they also seem to have been applied differently, right?
Yeah.
Designed to minimize lasting harm for the elite, but potentially devastating for others.
That's right. The subcapital penalties were really interesting because there wasn't one single model like the death penalty. This gave lawmakers a lot of room to experiment, you could say.
What kind of penalties are we talking about?
Things like fines, obviously, multe, temporary, banishment, relegatio, where you were kicked out of a certain area for a while.
Okay.
But perhaps most significantly, there were civil disabilities known as infamia.
Infamia. You mentioned could be devastating. What did it actually mean for someone, practically?
Think of it as a kind of social and legal deathlight. Infamia meant being stripped, either completely or partially, of your citizenship privileges. And that hit right at the core of what it meant to be a Roman citizen.
So what rights could you lose?
You could lose the right to vote, suffragetium, the right to stand for public office, honors, and, really crucially, the right to represent yourself or others in court. You lost your legal standing.
Wow.
And it wasn't just legal, it was a social stain. You might be barred from certain public places, like the public baths, which were central to Roman social life. It was this visible, permanent mark that basically crippled your ability to function as a full member of society.
That's leagues beyond a modern fine or even a short jail term. It fundamentally changed who you were in the eyes of the law and society.
Absolutely.
And yet, even this social death wasn't always enough to completely torpedo the future of an elite family, was it? There seems to have been this enduring privilege that could even survive individual disgrace.
Yeah, the Roman aristocracy was remarkably resilient. If a senator, say, had a major political fall, got condemned, faced disgrace, the rank his children had already attained wasn't automatically stripped away.
Really? So the family status could endure.
To a degree, yes. The system protected the generational hierarchy. For instance, if a disgraced senator was demoted, his daughter, assuming she'd married someone of appropriate rank, would generally keep her high social status, and that status would be legally recognized.
So it acted as a kind of safeguard for the class as a whole.
Exactly. It helped ensure that the senatorial class itself remained robust, generational, and wasn't entirely dependent on the shifting political fortunes of every single member. Privilege had buffers.
Okay, so if the anestiors had these deep legal shock absorbers, the humiliors, and especially the unfree had, well, basically none. Let's move down the ladder now to the ultimate lack of legal standing. Those who were considered property.
Right.
And this is where it gets really interesting, almost chilling, because you see the law engaging in this cold calculus to assess the value of a human life that happens to be owned by someone else.
It really forces you to confront the core concept of slavery, which fundamentally strips the individual of agency. Philosophers tried to grapple with it. The Stoics, for instance, defined slavery somewhat abstractly as the loss of the power of autonomous action.
Just a lack of control over oneself.
Yeah. But later thinkers, like Augustine, centuries later, wrestled more with the morality. He argued that slavery as an institution wasn't part of God's original design, but rather a consequence of sin, a kind of God's judgment on sinful mankind.
So a theological justification in a way.
A way to explain its existence, yeah. But regardless of the philosophical debates, the day-to-day legal reality was stark. A slave was primarily a valuable asset. Their personhood was legally secondary to their status as property.
And that property status dictated everything when harm occurred. If someone injured or killed a slave, the liability was based purely on the asset's value, right? Primarily under the lex Aquilia.
That's the key piece of legislation, the lex Aquilia. It essentially treated harming a slave like damaging any other piece of property.
So if you killed someone else's slave,
You were liable to the owner for damages. The amount was typically calculated based on the slave's highest value in the preceding year.
and it didn't matter if you thought the slave was free.
Nope. Crucially, the liability held even if the killer mistakenly believed the slave was a free man. The legal action wasn't really about homicide. It was about damage to property. You owed compensation to the owner, not the state.
The sources also get into really specific detail about injuries that didn't immediately kill the slave. How did they handle that? Like, if the slave recovered but then died later?
They were incredibly precise about this. Let's say a slave is wounded but initially recovers. The owner could book an action under Lex Aquilia right away for that initial injury, for the medical costs, the lost work time, the damage.
Okay.
Now, if that same slave later dies as a result of that original wound, the owner could bring another subsequent action, this time for the killing.
So they could sue twice for the same incident.
Yes, but, and this is key, the Roman jurists made sure the owner couldn't get unjustly enriched. There was a cap. The total damages recovered across all actions related to that single incident could not exceed the amount the owner could have claimed for the killing action right at the start.
Ah, I see. So you get compensated for the full loss eventually, but you can't profit by splitting the claims.
Exactly. It's a complex calculation to ensure the owner is made whole for the loss of their asset, but prevents double-dipping or profiteering from the injury and eventual death.
It just hammers home the slave's status as, well, a meticulously accounted for item of commerce.
It really does.
And we see similar kinds of complex calculations when slaves were used as collateral, as financial security, right? As pledges. There was that really tricky scenario posed by the jurist Papinian.
Oh, Papinian's scenario is a classic. It perfectly illustrates how Roman law factored risk into the value of a human being used as collateral.
Okay, walk us through it.
Imagine a creditor lends 10 ore gold coins and accepts 2 slaves as security, as a pledge. Together, these 2 slaves are definitely worth at least the 10 ore debt.
Right.
Now, suppose one of those slaves gets stolen from the creditor while they're holding them as security.
Okay, so the creditor still has one slave left.
Exactly. But Papinian says the creditor can still bring an action for theft against the thief and claim the full 10 ore, the entire value of the original debt.
Even though they still have the other slave who might be worth, say, 8 ore on their own. Why the full amount?
Because the law recognized that the creditor's security was now impaired. By losing one slave, the risk that the creditor wouldn't be able to recover the full 10 ore had significantly increased. What if the remaining slave got sick, or died, or ran away?
Ah, so the claim reflects the original value of the secured interest, factoring in the increased risk.
Precisely. The law allowed the creditor to claim the full value of the debt in the theft action because their financial interest in the pledge remained at that full 10 RAI until the debt was actually repaid. Losing part of the collateral increased their risk exposure back up to that full amount.
It's remarkably sophisticated financial thinking applied to human property.
Sophisticated and, yes, deeply callous from our perspective, it managed commercial risk involving human assets.
Okay, let's move just one small step up the social ladder to those who managed to escape bondage. The freedmen, the manumitted slaves.
Right, the libertinus or liberatus.
Their freedom wasn't necessarily complete freedom, was it? It often seems quite conditional.
Oh, absolutely. The status of a freedman was a really complex legal gray area. On paper, they became Roman citizens.
Well, this sounds good.
It sounds good, but it came with major strings attached. They immediately faced extensive public law disabilities. They couldn't hold most high offices, for example. And maybe most importantly, they remained legally tied to their former master, who is now called their patronus, or patron.
Tied how? What did they owe them?
They owed their patron-specific duties, operae, often involving labor or services. They owed them deference and respect, obsequium. And they couldn't sue their patron without permission. It was basically trading full servitude for a highly conditional, restricted form of freedom, often with lifelong obligations.
And in some places, getting freed wasn't even a clean break. You mentioned conditional manumission, where freedom itself was tied to future service or even producing children.
Yes, we see this very clearly in records from places like Kalimna, an island in the Aegean. A lot of the manumissions recorded there were conditional.
What kind of conditions?
Often it required the freed slave to continue serving the former owner, sometimes for the owner's entire lifetime, or even for the lifetime of 2 successive owners, like the owner and their heir.
Wow, that's hardly freedom.
It's limited freedom. Another common condition was requiring the freed person, usually a woman, to produce a certain number of children who would then belong to the owner or the owner's heir.
So they were freed, but obligated to provide future slaves for the family.
Essentially, yes. It wasn't a clean break from bondage at all. It was more like a transition from being direct property to being bound by a perpetual, often multi-generational contractual obligation.
So thinking of this economically, even if the actual price someone paid in cash for this conditional freedom stayed the same over time,
Right.
the actual cost of that freedom was effectively going up if the terms, the obligations, got harsher. Like longer service, more children required.
That's the crucial economic insight, exactly. If the nominal price, the cash paid for conditional release, was stable, but the terms, the length of service, the duties owed, the required number of children became tougher, then the true economic cost of that limited freedom rose significantly.
And at the same time, was the price for getting full freedom without conditions also changing?
Yes, the evidence suggests the price for full unconditional manumission was generally rising too. So genuine autonomy was becoming an increasingly expensive proposition, and maybe even the cheaper conditional option was becoming less appealing as the obligations increased.
It paints a picture of freedom being very hard to attain and often incomplete when it was.
Very much so.
And just one last point on freedmen. There were even restrictions that seemed based more on morality than strict law. Something about marriage.
Yeah, it's an interesting little detail. There was a rule seemingly based more on Roman ideas of propriety and morality, mores, rather than a specific statute, that said a freedman couldn't marry his own mother or sister if they had also been freed from the same household.
Even though legally they weren't related by blood necessarily and were now free citizens.
Right. The logic seems to have been based on the fact that they'd lived together in a quasi-familial, albeit enslaved, unit. Even though the legal relationship of slavery was broken, this underlying moral sensibility about incestuous relationships rooted in their shared past was maintained as a social boundary. Citizenship rules could be bent, but this deep taboo held firm.
Okay, so we've established this picture of Roman law, rigidly status-based, obsessed with property, class, formal procedures, and differential punishment. Let's shift geography now and maybe legal philosophy a bit to classical Athens.
A different beast, in many
The
ways.
Athenian law seems rooted more in ideas of civic honor, personal relationships, and maybe a more direct form of citizen justice. It presents an alternative system, but one that was still incredibly sensitive to status and social standing, just maybe in different ways.
Definitely. And one of the most striking things right off the bat is the unique role of personal animosity in Athenian legal practice.
Animosity, you mean like grudges?
Exactly. The key concept here is ekthra, which translates roughly as enmity or personal hostility.
Mm.
And the crucial difference from, say, modern ideals is that in Athens, the courts were seen as a perfectly proper, even respectable place to pursue these personal hostilities.
So admitting you were suing someone because you were enemies was...
Oh, more than okay. A prosecutor openly declaring that the defendant was their ekthros, their personal enemy, was often considered a valid, even expected justification for bringing a lawsuit. The idea was that the demands of personal honor or settling scores with your enemies often aligned with the broader demands of justice in the Athenian mind.
So if you were in a political rivalry, taking your opponent to court was just another move in the game. It wasn't seen as purely vindictive or petty.
Not necessarily if it was perceived as being rooted in genuine rivalry or a legitimate grievance between equals or known opponents. Athenians were careful to draw a distinction here
Distinction between...
between what they saw as respectable litigation driven by ekphra, which was part of public life, and what they called sycophancy.
Sycophancy. That sounds bad.
It was universally condemned. Sycophancy meant bringing malicious lawsuits, often beastless ones, purely for financial gain, essentially, trying to blackmail or extort money from someone, usually someone richer or weaker, through legal harassment.
Okay, so extra was about honor and rivalries. Sycophancy was about greed.
That's a good way to put it. Even critics of Athenian democracy recognize this distinction. They might complain that under democracy, prominent men were often attacked for the sake of enmity, meaning political motives, but also sometimes for the sake of money, the sycophantic motive. The first was seen as a maybe unfortunate but understandable consequence of political life. The second was just base corruption.
This focus on honor, rivalry, personal standing, it leads us directly to the Athenian concept of hubris, doesn't it? Which wasn't just arrogance, but had a specific legal meaning related to violence and status.
Precisely. Hubris in a legal context wasn't just any violence. It was violence or insult, specifically intended to degrade or dishonor the victim, to treat them as socially inferior, thereby violating their status as a free citizen.
Can you give an example of how that status element worked?
The classic example used in Athenian speeches is about whipping. Striking a free Athenian citizen with a whip was considered a prime example of hubris. Why? Not just because it hurt, but because whipping is how you treated slaves.
Ah, so the act itself implied the victim was no better than a slave.
Exactly. The real injury wasn't just the physical pain, it was the deliberate public degradation of the victim's civic standing, an assault on their social identity and honor as a free man. That was the core of hubris.
Okay, so hubris was a serious attack on someone's fundamental status as a citizen. Given that gravity, what kinds of punishments could Athenian courts hand out? Were they proportional to the physical harm or to the insult?
They could be incredibly severe, potentially even capital punishment. The punishment aimed to match the severity of the insult to civic dignity, not just the physical damage.
Death penalty for an insult.
For severe hubris, yes. The Athenians reserved the ultimate penalty for acts that were seen as fundamentally violating the honor and status of a free person. We have records, like those mentioned by the Order Dinarchus.
What do they say?
He recounts cases where death was inflicted for major sexual offenses, which were often framed as hubris, and other severe acts of degradation. For example, he mentions a miller named Menon who was supposedly executed for forcibly keeping a free boy in his mill, an act seen as treating the boy like property.
Yeah.
Or another case involving a man named Themistius, allegedly executed for committing hubris against a lyre maker during a public festival. These punishments seem wildly disproportionate if you only consider the physical act, but they make sense if you understand that the core offense was the shattering assault on the victim's honor and status.
It sounds like the Athenian justice system was very responsive, maybe even hyper-responsive, to the will and sensitivities of the citizens, the demos.
Yeah, it certainly could be.
But didn't this very direct, radical form of democracy draw criticism? I seem to remember philosophers like Aristotle having some issues with it.
Oh, Aristotle definitely did. He analyzed democracy extensively, of course, but he pointed to what he saw as crucial defects in the really radical Athenian model. Two main things stand out. First, he really disliked the fact that the demos, the citizen assembly, could effectively override established written law just by popular vote.
So the people's will trumped the law books.
Potentially, yes. If the assembly could just pass a decree that contradicted a law, Aristotle argued, then you don't really have the rule of law, you have the rule of the masses, which he saw as unstable.
And the second defect.
He was critical of the constant, and he thought excessive accountability of magistrates. In Athens, any citizen could bring charges against officials, subject them to audits, reviews, lawsuits.
If officials were always looking over their shoulder.
Exactly. Aristotle felt this constant scrutiny, this overturning of all the magistracies, as he put it, made effective governance impossible. No administrator could function properly if they were under perpetual threat of prosecution by any citizen with a grievance.
And his conclusion was,
His famous conclusion was that a state where the laws don't rule supreme, but where the demos holds the ultimate power through decrees, isn't really a constitution, politia, at all. It lacks the stability and predictability that comes from the supremacy of law. This is a real contrast with the Roman system, which sought stability through hierarchy and established procedure, not direct popular will.
interesting contrast. But regardless of Aristotle's critique, this system certainly made law a central part of everyday Athenian life, didn't it? They had a reputation for being quite litigious.
Oh, absolutely. That reputation was widespread in the ancient world. Contemporary writers often commented on the Athenians' proverbial fondness for litigation. It suggests law wasn't just some abstract code. It was a deeply embedded social practice, a primary tool for navigating public life.
So being a citizen meant being ready to go to court.
Pretty much. Athenian citizenship was holistic. You were expected to be a soldier when needed, participate in politics, maybe hold office, and yes, be prepared to be a litigant, to use the courts to defend your honor, pursue your enemies, settle disputes, enforce contracts. The law courts were a central arena for civic life, maybe the central arena outside the assembly itself. It was the ultimate expression of active, engaged citizenship, for better or worse. #TAC conclusion.
This has been, well, quite a journey through the less glamorous side of ancient law. We've looked at two systems, Rome and Athens, vastly different in many ways,
Different structures, different philosophies.
yet both fundamentally obsessed with status.
Mm.
In Rome, we saw a formal, explicit hierarchy where punishment was doled out based on your rank, the honestiores protected by privilege, the humiliores and slaves subject to brutal, degrading penalties, their bodies treated almost like disposable assets.
Right, a system designed to maintain rigid social divisions through law.
And then in Athens, a different flavor. Justice was often channeled through personal enmity, echthra, and the absolute necessity of defending one's civic honor. The worst crimes were acts of hubris, degradation that struck at the core of a free man's identity, meriting the harshest penalties.
Two different paths, maybe, but leading to a similar place. The major takeaway really seems undeniable. In both of these foundational legal traditions, your status, whether it was defined by birth, wealth, citizenship, freedom, or lack thereof, was the ultimate determinant of how you experienced justice.
So if we pull all this together, what's the final layer? Why should we, today, care about these ancient systems of legal inequality?
I think the relevance lies in understanding the mechanisms.
Yeah.
These complex legal categories we've talked about, Roman infamia, Papinian's risk calculations on human collateral, Athenian echthra and hubris, they weren't just, dusty legal terms.
There were tools.
Exactly. They were explicit tools wielded, consciously or unconsciously, by the powerful to enforce hierarchy, to maintain control. They regulated who could own property, whose body was inviolable, and whose wasn't, whose reputation mattered. The systems were often designed structurally to make it incredibly difficult for those at the bottom to rise, and remarkably easy for the established elites to maintain their generational standing, even through individual setbacks.
So, seeing how ancient laws were explicitly biased towards established interests, it forces us to look critically at our own assumptions about law today, to ask whose interests are really being served by modern legal structures, even if they claim blindness.
Precisely. And it makes us think about resource allocation, too, which brings us back to Rome and the spectacle of punishment.
Right. We've detailed how incredibly severe and public Roman punishment could be, especially for the lower classes.
Mm.
It was a massive public spectacle.
A huge expenditure of state resources, the arenas, the animals, the guards.
But interestingly, we also noted that not everyone in the elite necessarily bought into it wholesale. You mentioned Cicero expressing disdain for things like gladiatorial shows.
Yeah, Cicero, in his philosophical works, critiques wasteful public expenditures. He lists things like gladiatorial shows or huge public banquets or wild beast hunts put on for entertainment. He wasn't arguing from a position of mercy for the condemned, necessarily.
What was his argument then?
It was more of a pragmatic and maybe moral critique of the spending. He contrasted these wasteful spectacles with what he saw as more appropriate uses of wealth and public funds, things like ransoming captives, helping friends financially, paying for daughters' weddings. He even praises Aristotle for making similar points about misallocated resources.
There's this fascinating contradiction.
Okay.
The Roman state relies heavily on these brutal public spectacles of punishment to enforce social order and hierarchy through fear.
The arena is an extension of the justice system.
Yet within the elite itself, there's this pragmatic, almost fiscal conservative critique, viewing these same spectacles as a morally questionable, wasteful public expense.
It's a real tension. They needed the terror, but some questioned the cost and the morality of the entertainment value derived from it.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe. Does that ancient critique the argument about how resources are allocated, about funding spectacular public punishments versus, say, civic necessities or genuine social support, does that still resonate today? When we look at our own public spending priorities, especially around justice and punishment versus other social needs.
It certainly offers a provocative lens, doesn't it? It makes you think about the cost, the utility, and perhaps the enduring morality or lack thereof of public displays of state power then and now.
A lot to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the anatomy of status and punishment in ancient law.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to peel back the layers on these systems.